Well, welcome. We've had a bit of a break from our training, and so what I was just going to do initially is follow up on what we've been doing this year. And last year we looked a lot at composition and the way that composition contributed to the aesthetics and the emotive narrative of a photograph. And a lot of us think of creating a photo as being all about the subject and where the subject is placed within the image and what the subject is. But I think that underlying all of our discussions, I've always talked about light being almost more important than the subject, because even the most boring subject, if it's photographed in the best light possible, it will look amazing. Whereas the most amazing subject, if it's photographed in really poor light, will look terrible. So light is actually made up of two major components. It's colour and it's tone. And we've explored colour and how to look for colour in our environment that will contribute to making a great photo. And within looking at colour, we looked at complementary colours and how they popped against each other and really gave an image life. And we looked at harmonious and analogous colours, which are much more easy on the eye, but give an emotive feeling of calmness and harmony. We looked at how we can edit colour within our editing programs to optimise the warms and cools, and also in case the light that was falling on our subject was not advantageous to that subject, how to actually change it in our editing software. So we really explored colour and also the emotive components of colour, where we talked about how red usually means sexy, dangerous. It's a very dynamic colour, whereas something like blue is a much more calming colour, and green, particularly because it represents nature to us, is a much more calming colour. So we looked at how just the different colours contributed to that emotion and narrative that an image gave. After we really explored colour, we then moved on to tone. And whereas colour is the hue of something, tone is the level of brightness of different components in our image. And we looked last week at how we could see tone, and we also looked at the histogram and how the tones were represented in a histogram. And one of the things that I left you for homework was to go away and check if your camera could display the histogram, and to say to you, always have that histogram available to you to see in your display. Don't use what you see in the back of the screen as, oh, well, that photo looked like it was well exposed. It is very hard to see when we're out in daylight all of the nuances of a good exposure. And when we were talking about the histogram last week, we talked about the fact what it does is actually show us graphically where the tones in our image are. And from left to right, it has a scale of 255. And the number of pixels in our image that actually display these tones is in the vertical axis, whereas the x-axis takes us from pure black to pure white and sort of highlights right at this end, and absolutely pure black darkness at this end, and everything in the middle goes from very dark grey through to pure white. So reading the histogram is a skill that I really suggest you work on. And the best way to do that is when you're in your editing software, if you can display the histogram for each image, you can look at the image and then try and guess what the histogram would look like. And move the brightness sliders and see how that changes your image and how it changes the histogram. So being histogram fluent in reading is one of the best skills that you can learn to ensure that when you're out in the field shooting, that you get the best exposure you can. And a lot of people say to me, oh, I don't care, it's too dark, I'll just fix it later in Photoshop or Lightroom or whatever. The trouble is that fixing it later actually starts to degrade your image. If you can capture in your camera the perfect exposure, then you won't start degrading it. And the degrading starts happening in the pixelation of your images. What we're going to do next year is actually really look at exposure and how you can control your camera to get the best exposure. But right now, what I want you to recognize is if your histogram has lots and lots of pixels up here, it means that your image is dark. If it has lots and lots of pixels up here, it means that your image is light. And all the pixels in between, in this area here, are shades of grey. So what we're going to look at today is tone in an image and what looks good. Typically, when we're looking at tone of an image, it's a lot easier to see in black and white, because when we have colour in an image, we have to train our brain to turn that colour into what it represents in terms of tone. And tone is represented in black and white. And you can see this image here has everything in its tones, from pale greys, pure whites, through to pure blacks, which we get in here. And this is what we see in the histogram. We don't see a lot of pure white. Pure white is up at this end, but the image hasn't got very much pure white in it, probably just a bit through here. Most of the images in these mid greys and dark greys. So this is where we see the histogram representing most of the images in the mid greys and the dark greys, where there is some pure blacks in here. So the blacks in the window are represented here. So the histogram is a graphical representation of the tones within your image. One of the ways to see tones is to actually squint at an image, and as you squint, your brain starts to see the tones rather than the colours. But you should always be able to look at an image and say, is this correctly exposed, by looking at its tones? And the way to confirm that is looking at the histogram. And yes, the histogram tells us it's well exposed. Well exposed images have very little of the image in pure black, ideally just slightly off that left-hand axis, and none on this right-hand axis. Because what happens when the image has a lot of those highlights or pure whites up here, they're very distracting and there's no detail. So we try and keep it as close to the right-hand border as we can, but a little bit fractionally off it so it doesn't blow out the highlights. Sometimes you can't help blowing out the highlights. When I say blow out, I mean it's got no detail in it, because we sometimes have what we call spectral highlights. And spectral highlights are when metal reflects sunlight. There's nothing you can do about that. So you don't bother exposing for it. You expose for the rest of the image and just allow those highlights to blow out. So ideally, if something's well exposed, we go from pure blacks to pure whites, and you can see here what it looks like in black and white, and then how these whites here are the music in the background, and the pure blacks are the stand behind and the neck of the guitar, and that's what would be represented here, and everything else is in the mid greys. What I want to talk about today is, rather than the even spread of pixels across all of the histogram, which typically gives us what we call a classic well-exposed photograph, is an even spread across the histogram. But a more creative exposure are ones that exposed to the right or exposed to the left. Now you can still see here there's a spread across the histogram. There's nothing that's pure black and it'll be so muddy we can't see any detail in it. And there's nothing that is absolutely pure white blowing out so we see no texture or no detail. It's across all the tones, but it's weighted towards one end. And when it's weighted towards the right-hand side, the brightness side, we call those photographs high key. And they're a really lovely aesthetic, and they also give a lovely narrative. When they're weighted to the left-hand side, we call these low key. It means that, yes, there's still whites, and you can see there's still pixels up here that have got whites in them, but most of the image is in the dark grays towards the blacks. And they're low key images, and they have a particular emotive feel as well, and they sort of tend to be dark and sinister and moody. So we'll just have a look at some of those. So this histogram you can see is weighted towards the right. It doesn't go down to the pure blacks. It is the darker part of the image is in the these would be charcoal sort of greys that these would convert to. But you can see the lightness and airiness it gives us when we have a subject like this and we can expose towards that end. So this requires us, when we're out there in the field looking, to see what's actually in front of us and then expose to get one of these really light, airy photographs. So this high key technique optimizes bright lighting, and we often use it to reduce or eliminate dark shadows. It needs to suit the subject we're actually shooting, and it results in a very bright, fresh, airy image with abundance of light tones. So it's a lightness and a freshness and a softness that it gives us. And it's often used in product, portrait and fashion photography. So you can see this aesthetic. Nowhere have we actually, we've probably blown out the whites right at this end here, but that's in parts of the image that it actually doesn't matter. Our subject is beautifully exposed, and these were just leaves on a, I can't remember the plant's name. It's in my garden, and it was backlit, and the backlighting really showed up the texture. So I wanted to really expose for that, and I just, behind it, it's a dogwood. Behind it, you can see the dogwood flower, but the sky is what is actually giving it its brightness at the background. So this is about composing for this particular sort of look to try and get something that you think is aesthetically pleasing. This photo's okay, but it's not amazing. But again, it gives you that really light, airy feeling. There's no pure blacks in this, but it gives an emotion. This scene is almost as it was shot. I could have exposed it. I deliberately exposed it as high key because I loved the pastels in it. This is what I saw. It was on Maria Island in Tasmania. And the pastels in the sky, the pastels in the mist in the background, the pastels in the landscape. I thought this will look really good if I can expose towards the right-hand side and just give it that painterly watercolor feel. So these are just some other examples where I've deliberately exposed, almost overexposed the image, but by overexposing, it actually gives it a really interesting aesthetic. So that's high key, where you increase the brightness of your exposure so that you really highlight the pastel look of your subject. And it doesn't matter that your background has no texture in it because you're trying to make the subject really stand out. And it was interesting, I used this technique. I was mentoring a girl a few weeks ago. We were at a school fete and she wanted to photographed the cake stall, which was inside a classroom. And you can imagine that the classroom was so cluttered, and trying to separate out the cakes and the vendor behind the stand, the lady, was really difficult to separate it from the background. So I said to her, look, turn around and use the window outside. Well, outside the sky was really, really bright. And I said to her, now expose, to blow that sky out, but expose for the lady and the cakes, which she did. And it ended up a really beautiful portrait, because the background was completely plain. The lady had these lovely pastel tones about her, and so did the cakes. And it was just a really much more interesting than getting a really cluttered classroom. So that was high key. Now we're going to have a look at low key. And I said low key is when we exposed for the histogram to be weighted down the left-hand side in all the dark shadows. We still can have some whites up here, but very little of the image is in the whites. Most of it is in the darks. And you can see it adds drama to the photograph. And typically there's only one light source in a low-key photo, and this was actually the sun coming through the roof. I took this when we were down at Docklands. So the lighting is not very bright, and there's usually a single light source. And that single light source will highlight aspects of the subject to make it look interesting, but the rest of the image is very dark and moody and mysterious and dramatic, and that's what gives it this emotive feel. So again, with this particular image, I'm just trying to think, I used a flash, I think, on this one, but really used like a snoot that went down the throat of the iris. Not typically what we don't usually use low-key for flowers, but you can get really good moody narratives with it. These are just a couple I've taken, the one that we took out at Westgarth. Again, a single light source coming through the roof skylights, and the rest of the image is dark and moody, and then you've just got this pop of light. And the same here on the right-hand side. Just the pop of light. There was, the sun was setting low, and the pansies on the table were just getting a shaft of light on them. And it just makes for an interesting photograph, far more interesting than if this had been completely even light. Again, dark and moody, exposed down this end of the spectrum, but just that pop of colour and lightness